The chandelier above held 200 candles, and every single one of them was lit for Genevieve. Aurelia counted them once, years ago, during another evening when she had been told to sit still and disappear. 200 flames, dripping slow wax tears onto the marble floor below, filling the grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor with a golden warmth that touched everyone in the room. Everyone except her. Stand behind the pillar, her stepmother, Lady Ashworth, had said an hour before the guests arrived. She had gripped Aurelia's chin between two cold fingers and tilted her face up like she was inspecting a horse at auction. Hold the tea tray. Speak to nobody. Smile at nobody. If a gentleman glances your way, lower your eyes and step further back. Tonight belongs to Genevieve. Do you understand? Aurelia had nodded, because she always nodded. Good girl. Those two words had followed Aurelia her entire life, and they never once meant what they were supposed to mean. So here she stood, tucked behind a wide stone pillar near the east wall, holding a silver tray with 3 porcelain cups that nobody had touched. Her dress was a faded gray muslin, 2 seasons old, and let out at the seams. Her hair was pinned in a simple knot, with no ribbons or combs. She looked like a servant. That was the point. Across the ballroom, Genevieve sparkled. Her stepsister wore a gown of ivory silk, trimmed with seed pearls, the kind that cost more than what most families in the county earned in a full year. Her golden curls bounced with every rehearsed laugh. She moved through the crowd like she had been born on a stage, which, in many ways, she had. Lady Ashworth had spent 15 years grooming Genevieve into the perfect ornament. A daughter who could sing on command, recite poetry on command, and charm wealthy men on command. Tonight, the wealthy man in question was Duke Julian Ashford. He had arrived at 8:30 in a black tailcoat with a high collar, his dark hair combed back and his jaw set, with the quiet patience of someone who had attended far too many of these evenings. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and younger than most dukes Aurelia had seen at these gatherings. Perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two less. The whispers about him had started the moment his carriage pulled up to the gravel drive. Patron of the Royal Academy, one woman had murmured behind her fan. Unmarried, another had added, as though that single word carried more weight than everything else combined. Genevieve had practically floated towards him the moment he entered, her voice rising above the string quartet in the corner. "Your Grace, what an absolute honor. I must tell you, I have been studying the works of Sir Joshua Reynolds with great devotion. His portraits capture the very essence of the soul. Do you not agree?" Aurelia watched from behind her pillar. She watched Julian offer a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. She watched him nod along as Genevieve launched into a long, breathless speech about classical art, one that Lady Ashworth had written for her and made her memorize over the past 3 days. The interplay of shadow and luminescence in Reynolds' later period is simply extraordinary, Genevieve declared, gesturing dramatically with one gloved hand. I often attempt to capture that same spirit in my own humble paintings. Aurelia bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted iron. Her own humble paintings. The words burned like turpentine on raw skin. Because those paintings, every single one of them, were Aurelia's. She had been painting since she was 9 years old, since her late father had placed a horsehair brush in her small hand and shown her how to mix linseed oil with ground pigment on a wooden palette. He had called her his little Rembrandt. He had told her she had a gift that came along once in a generation. And then he had died, and Lady Ashworth had married into the family, and everything that belonged to Aurelia slowly became Genevieve's. Her bedroom, her mother's jewelry, her place at the dining table, and finally, her paintings. It had started small, a watercolor of the garden that Genevieve claimed she had done ages ago, a charcoal sketch of the family dog that somehow ended up signed with Genevieve's initials. Then it grew. Oil canvases, commissioned portraits for neighbors, a landscape of the Blackwood Valley so detailed and luminous that 3 gentlemen had offered to purchase it on the spot, all painted by Aurelia, all credited to Genevieve. Lady Ashworth had arranged the entire scheme with the efficiency of a battlefield general. She kept Aurelia locked in the attic with her paints and turpentine, producing work after work, while Genevieve smiled and bowed and accepted praise in the drawing rooms below. And tonight was the grandest performance yet. Duke Julian Ashford was known across England as the most influential patron of living artists. A single word of approval from him could secure a painter's entry into the Royal Academy exhibition. A commission from his estate could set an artist up for life. Lady Ashworth had spent a small fortune on tonight's dinner, tonight's wine, and tonight's dress, all to dangle Genevieve in front of the Duke as a rare artistic prodigy. Aurelia shifted her weight behind the pillar and adjusted the tray in her aching arms. A cup rattled faintly against its saucer. She steadied it with practiced stillness. That was when she noticed him looking at her. Duke Julian had turned away from Genevieve mid-sentence. His gaze had drifted past the crowd, past the candelabras and the silk curtains and the women in their fine gowns, and landed directly on Aurelia. She froze. His eyes were sharp and dark, the color of wet ink, and they held a kind of attention that felt entirely different from anything she had experienced before. He was studying her the way she studied a canvas before the first brushstroke, with focus, with curiosity, with the slow patience of someone who wanted to understand what he was truly seeing. His gaze dropped to her hands. Aurelia's stomach turned to ice. She looked down and saw it immediately, the thing she had missed when scrubbing her hands earlier. A faint crescent of Prussian blue oil paint, lodged stubbornly beneath the edge of her lace cuff, right along the pale skin between her thumb and wrist, the one color that never washed out easily. When she looked back up, the Duke's expression had changed. One corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, like a man who had picked up a book, expecting nothing, and stumbled upon a remarkable first line. Genevieve was still talking. She hadn't noticed that her audience had already left her. Julian raised his glass in Aurelia's direction, a gesture so small and brief that nobody else in the room caught it. Then he turned back to Genevieve and resumed his polite, empty smile. Aurelia's heart hammered beneath her gray muslin. He had seen the paint. He knew. The ball should have ended at 11. Lady Ashworth had planned every minute of the evening down to the final course of syllabub and candied almonds, and by 11 o'clock, the carriages were supposed to be rolling back down the gravel drive, carrying with them the Duke's glowing admiration for Genevieve's artistic genius. Instead, at 11:15, Duke Julian made a request that sent Lady Ashworth's carefully constructed evening spinning sideways. "I understand the family keeps a private gallery," he said, setting his wineglass on the mantelpiece with casual authority. "I would very much like to see it before I depart." Lady Ashworth's smile tightened at the edges. The gallery had not been part of the plan. The gallery was supposed to come later, during a formal luncheon she had been arranging for the following week, after Genevieve had been given more time to rehearse her answers about technique and process. But one did not refuse a duke. "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Ashworth said, her voice bright as polished brass. "Genevieve, darling, fetch the lanterns. We shall give His Grace a private tour." Genevieve's face went pale for half a heartbeat before her practiced smile returned. She turned on her silk heel and nearly collided with Aurelia, who had been clearing empty glasses from a side table near the corridor. "Lanterns," Genevieve hissed through her teeth. "3 of them, and then stay out of sight." Aurelia said nothing. She gathered 3 oil lanterns from the servants' hall, lit each one with steady hands, and followed the small procession down the east corridor towards the gallery. Blackwood Manor's private gallery occupied a long, narrow room on the ground floor, originally built as a conservatory by Aurelia's grandfather. The walls were lined with deep green damask, and the paintings hung in gilded frames at careful intervals, each one illuminated by the warm amber glow of the lanterns Aurelia carried. There were 14 paintings in total. Aurelia had created 12 of them. She positioned herself in the doorway, holding 2 lanterns high, while a footman took the third inside. The warm light fell across the canvases, and even from where she stood, Aurelia felt the familiar ache of seeing her own work displayed under someone else's name. Julian moved slowly along the wall, his hands clasped behind his back. He paused at each painting with the careful attention of a man who had spent years training his eye. A still life of winter pears, a moody seascape with storm clouds rolling above chalk cliffs. A portrait of an old groundskeeper, his weathered face rendered with such tenderness that the wrinkles around his eyes seemed to hold entire decades of quiet labor. "Remarkable," Julian murmured, leaning closer to the groundskeeper's portrait. "The layering here is extraordinary. Whoever painted this understands glazing at a level I have seen in perhaps 5 living artists in all of England." Lady Ashworth placed a proud hand on Genevieve's shoulder. "My daughter has always possessed a rare sensitivity to the human face." Julian straightened and turned to Genevieve. His expression remained perfectly pleasant, perfectly neutral, giving away nothing. "Tell me about your process with this one," he said. "The skin tones have a warmth that suggests you mixed your base with something unusual. What was your ground layer?" Genevieve blinked. "My ground layer? Yes, the preparation beneath the paint. It affects how light passes through the upper glazes. Yours has a reddish undertone that reminds me of Venetian work. Did you use a red bullground or something closer to burnt sienna?" The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Aurelia counted them from the doorway, each one heavier than the last. "I used a brown," Genevieve said finally. "A warm brown, mixed with oils." Julian tilted his head. "Which oils?" "The usual ones." Another pause. Julian's gaze flickered. Just once, just briefly, towards the doorway where Aurelia stood with the lanterns. She kept her face perfectly still, but she could feel the muscles in her jaw tighten. The ground layer on that portrait had been a mixture of Venetian red, yellow ochre, and a thin wash of raw umber, bound with cold-pressed linseed oil and thinned with Venice turpentine. She could have described it with her eyes closed. She had spent 3 days preparing that ground alone, before laying down a single stroke of paint. "And this landscape," Julian continued, moving to the largest canvas on the far wall. "This valley scene, the light direction suggests late autumn, perhaps early October, when the sun sits low enough to cast those long amber shadows across open fields. But the foliage still carries summer greens in the upper canopy. That is a very specific window of time to capture. Did you paint this en plein air, or from sketches?" Genevieve's lips parted, closed, parted again. "From memory," she said. "I have a wonderful memory for landscapes." "From memory," Julian repeated. He let the words sit in the air like drying varnish. "That is truly impressive. Most painters I know require dozens of preparatory sketches to achieve this level of accuracy. With natural light." Aurelia's lantern hand trembled. She steadied it against the doorframe and lowered her eyes, but the damage had already been done. She had winced, a tiny, involuntary flinch at the absurdity of Genevieve claiming to paint an autumn valley from memory when she could not tell the difference between cadmium yellow and Naples yellow if both were placed side by side on a palette. When Aurelia raised her eyes again, Julian was watching her. He held her gaze for only a moment. There was no accusation in his expression, no dramatic revelation, just a quiet confirmation settling behind those dark eyes, the way a final puzzle piece clicks flat into its place, without ceremony. He knew. He had suspected it downstairs at the ball, and now he was certain. "A magnificent collection," Julian said, turning back to Lady Ashworth, with the smooth ease of a man who understood exactly when to reveal his cards and when to keep them pressed against his chest. "I look forward to seeing more of your daughter's work at the Royal Academy exhibition this week." Lady Ashworth beamed. Genevieve exhaled, and Aurelia stood in the doorway, lanterns burning low in her steady hands, wondering what a duke intended to do with a secret that could unravel her entire world. The carriage left Blackwood Manor at 7 o'clock the following morning, before the ground fog had lifted from the hedgerows along the London road. Aurelia sat on the rear-facing bench with her back to the horses, which was where Lady Ashworth always placed her, facing backwards, watching the world she was leaving behind rather than the one approaching. Genevieve occupied the forward-facing seat beside her mother, wrapped in a pelisse of dove-gray wool with fur trimming at the collar. She had not spoken a word since they had climbed into the carriage. Her gloved fingers kept twisting the ribbons of her bonnet into tight spirals, releasing them, then twisting again. The rhythm of it filled the silence like a small, anxious clock. Lady Ashworth let the quiet stretch for exactly 4 miles. Aurelia knew because she had been counting the stone mile markers through the window, the way she always did on long journeys to keep her mind occupied with something other than dread. At the 4th marker, Lady Ashworth spoke. He was testing her. The words came out flat and hard, aimed at no one in particular, though they landed squarely on Aurelia. Ground layers, oil ratios, plain air sketches. Lady Ashworth pulled each phrase from memory like thorns from a glove. He was not making polite conversation. He was conducting an examination, and Genevieve was not prepared. "I answered as best I could, Mama," Genevieve said, her voice climbing into the brittle register it always reached when she sensed blame shifting in her direction. "You told him you painted a valley from memory. Well, what was I supposed to say? You were supposed to say you worked from preparatory sketches, like any trained painter. I told you this. We rehearsed this. You rehearsed light and shadow and Reynolds. Nobody said anything about ground layers. The carriage hit a rut in the road, and all 3 women jolted sideways. Aurelia caught the edge of the window frame to steady herself. When she settled back, Lady Ashworth's eyes were fixed on her, with the cold precision of a woman threading a needle in poor light. "You flinched." Aurelia's stomach dropped. "I beg your pardon?" "In the gallery, when Genevieve was speaking about the landscape. You flinched. I saw it, and more importantly, the Duke saw it. The lantern was heavy. My arm was tired. Do not insult me with lies, Aurelia. I have spent 10 years watching your face for exactly these moments. You think you are clever with your silence and your downcast eyes, but your body speaks when your mouth does not." That little flinch told the Duke everything he needed to suspect. Aurelia looked out the window. The Hertfordshire countryside rolled past in soft greens and browns, the kind of palette she could mix from memory. Sap green, raw umber, a touch of yellow ochre thinned with turpentine until the fields blurred soft at the horizon. She wanted to be out there, sitting on a folding stool with her portable easel, painting the morning mist as it burned away under the early sun. Instead, she was here. "The Royal Academy exhibition opens in 3 days," Lady Ashworth continued. "There will be judges, critics, and titled patrons from every major house in England. If Genevieve secures the Royal Commission, our family's standing changes permanently. She will have suitors, she will have invitations, she will have a future." Lady Ashworth leaned forward, and the shadow of her bonnet brim fell across her face like a curtain being drawn. "And you will have a roof over your head and meals on your table, which is more than you deserve, considering you bring nothing else to this family." The words should have hurt less by now. Aurelia had heard variations of them for a decade. Ever since her father's death had left her a 12-year-old orphan in the legal care of a woman who viewed her as little more than a useful inconvenience. But words like these had a way of finding fresh skin, no matter how many times they had struck before. "If you speak a single word to anyone about who paints those canvases," Lady Ashworth said, "I will turn you out of this house before the week is finished. No reference, no letter of character, no trunk of belongings. You will walk out the front door in whatever dress you are wearing and find your own way in the world. And we both know what becomes of young women with no family, no income, and no name worth mentioning." Genevieve had stopped twisting her bonnet ribbons. She stared at the floor of the carriage, her face unreadable. Whether she felt guilt, or relief, or something else entirely, Aurelia could not tell. The two of them had never been close enough for Aurelia to read her stepsister's heart with any accuracy. "Do you understand me?" Lady Ashworth asked. "Yes, ma'am. You will prepare 2 new canvases for the exhibition. 1 landscape, 1 portrait. You will have them completed by tomorrow evening, and Genevieve will present them under her own name, as she has always done. You will remain in the attic. You will remain invisible, and you will keep your hands scrubbed clean of paint, so that no wandering duke can spot pigment on your skin, like some common street dauber." Aurelia folded her hands in her lap and pressed her thumbnails into her palms until the pressure grounded her somewhere solid. She thought about the lapis lazuli pigment she had been saving for months, the tiny glass jar of ultramarine blue that she kept hidden behind a loose board in the attic wall. She thought about the blank canvas stretched and primed on her easel back at the townhouse, waiting for her brush the way an empty page waits for a pen. Lady Ashworth wanted 2 paintings for Genevieve. She would get them. But somewhere between the 4th mile marker and the 5th, Aurelia made a quiet decision that had nothing to do with obedience. She would paint a 3rd canvas, one that Genevieve would never see, one that Lady Ashworth would never touch, and one that would carry Aurelia's own name in the bottom corner, signed in pigment that no amount of scrubbing could wash away. She did not know how she would get it to the exhibition. She did not know what would happen if she tried, but the decision sat in her chest, like a coal that had finally caught flame after years of smoldering, and she held it there, quietly, as the carriage rolled south towards London. London smelled of coal smoke and horse dung and baking bread, all layered together in a way that Aurelia had never quite gotten used to. The townhouse Lady Ashworth kept on Harley Street was narrow and tall, squeezed between a solicitor's office and the home of a retired naval captain who coughed through his open windows at all hours. It was not a grand address, but it was respectable enough to maintain appearances, and maintaining appearances was the only currency Lady Ashworth truly understood. They arrived just before noon. By past, Aurelia had been sent to the attic, with instructions to begin work immediately on the 2 exhibition canvases. By 1 o'clock, she had stretched and primed both frames and set them against the wall to dry. And by 1:30, she had invented an errand. "The linseed oil is nearly finished," she told the housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, holding up a bottle with barely an inch of amber liquid remaining at the bottom. "And we are out of turpentine entirely. If I do not purchase more this afternoon, the canvases will not be ready by tomorrow evening." Mrs. Potts, a round woman with flour perpetually dusted across her apron, squinted at the bottle and sighed. "Her ladyship will not be pleased if you are wandering about. Her ladyship will be far less pleased if the paintings are not finished on time." This was the kind of logic that worked on Mrs. Potts, who understood deadlines and consequences better than most people in the household. She handed Aurelia a few coins from the kitchen jar and waved her towards the back door. "Be quick about it, and for heaven's sake, keep your bonnet on. You look half feral with your hair loose like that." Aurelia tucked her hair beneath a plain straw bonnet, pulled on her oldest pair of gloves, and slipped out through the servants' entrance into the narrow alley behind Harley Street. The walk to Brooks & Son, fine art suppliers, took 20 minutes through the winding streets south of Oxford Road. The shop occupied the ground floor of a crooked Georgian building on a lane so narrow that 2 men could barely pass each other without turning sideways. Its front window displayed a dusty arrangement of palette knives, stretched canvases, and glass jars filled with pigments in every shade, from bone black to vermilion. A small brass bell rang above the door when Aurelia pushed it open, and the familiar smell of linseed and ground chalk wrapped around her like a homecoming. She loved this place. She had been visiting Brooks & Son since she was 13, first with her father and later alone, spending whatever pennies she could scrape together on supplies that Lady Ashworth refused to fund. Old Mr. Brooks had died 2 winters ago, but his son Thomas still recognized her and always set aside any damaged brushes or end-of-batch pigments that he could not sell at full price. Today, Aurelia needed turpentine, linseed oil, and one very specific item, a set of fine badger hair brushes suitable for detail work on portrait features. The 3rd canvas, the secret one, would be a portrait. She had already decided. Landscapes were safer, less personal, easier to admire from a distance. But a portrait demanded something more honest. It required the painter to look closely at another human being and translate what she saw onto the canvas with absolute truthfulness. That was the kind of painting that one commissions. That was the kind of painting that could change a life. She was standing near the back of the shop, holding a badger hair brush up to the light from the window and examining the taper of its bristles, when the brass bell rang again behind her. "Mr. Brooks, good afternoon. I am looking for Venetian turpentine, the genuine article, if you have it, and not the pine resin substitute that half the suppliers in London have been passing off this season." Aurelia's hand went still around the brush. She knew that voice. It carried the same measured calm she had heard in the gallery the previous evening, the same careful weight on each word, as though the speaker considered language a tool that deserved proper handling. She turned slowly. Duke Julian stood inside the doorway, dressed in a simple dark coat, without any of the decorative finery he had worn to the ball. His cravat was loosely tied, his boots were scuffed with actual street dust, and he carried a leather folio under one arm that looked well used and ink-stained at the corners. Without his title announced by livery and carriages, he could have passed for any educated gentleman browsing the artisan quarter on a Tuesday afternoon. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Something shifted in his expression, a brief flash of recognition, followed by what Aurelia could only describe as satisfaction, the look of a man who had just found a book he had been searching for, on exactly the shelf where he hoped it would be. "Miss Ashworth," he said, removing his hat. Aurelia curtsied, still holding the brush. "Your Grace." A pause settled between them. Thomas Brooks had disappeared into the back room to search for the Venetian turpentine, leaving them alone among the shelves of pigment jars and rolls of Belgian linen. Julian glanced at the brush in her hand. "Badger hair, Series 4, if I am reading the ferrule correctly. That is a portraitist's brush." "It is. Your sister prefers landscapes, I was told." The sentence sat in the air between them like a half-open door. Aurelia could step through it, or step back from it. Every warning Lady Ashworth had delivered in the carriage that morning pressed against the inside of her ribs. "These are for household use," she said carefully. "Decorative screens. Lady Ashworth enjoys painted fire screens for the drawing room." Julian studied her for a long moment. Then he lifted a jar of hog bristle filaments from the nearest shelf and examined it with the idle curiosity of a man who was in absolutely no hurry. "I have a question about varnish," he said. "Perhaps you can help, since Mr. Brooks is occupied. I recently acquired a canvas from the last century that has developed a milky bloom across the upper varnish layer. The previous owner used a spirit varnish, but I suspect the original artist intended a copal base. If I were to remove the upper layer and revarnish, would you recommend dissolving the spirit coat with rectified alcohol, or would a gentler solvent preserve the paint beneath more reliably?" It was a test. Aurelia recognized it the way she recognized a loaded brushstroke on canvas, by the weight it carried beneath the surface. A household girl who painted fire screens would have no answer to this question. A trained artist with years of experience would. She hesitated for precisely 2 seconds. Then something inside her, the same coal that had caught flame in the carriage that morning, burned through the last of her caution. "Rectified alcohol is too aggressive for aged spirit varnish," she said. "It penetrates unevenly and risks pulling the upper glaze layers along with the coating. A mixture of oil of spike lavender and a small quantity of turpentine, applied with soft cotton in thin passes, will dissolve the spirit varnish gradually without disturbing the original paint film. Once stripped, I would revarnish with mastic dissolved in turpentine rather than copal. Copal yellows over decades, and if the canvas is already a century old, you want a finish that will age cleanly for the next 100 years." Julian lowered the jar of hog bristles. He looked at her the way one painter looks at another when craft is recognized across a room, across a conversation, across all the barriers that titles and money and circumstances place between people who see the world through the same eyes. "Fire screens," he said quietly, and the ghost of a smile crossed his face. Aurelia felt heat rise along her neck. She had said too much. She had said exactly enough. The brass bell rang as Thomas Brooks returned with a dark glass bottle, and the moment folded shut, like a sketchbook clasped between leather covers. Julian purchased his turpentine, tipped his hat to Aurelia, and walked out into the afternoon light, without another word. But as Aurelia watched him disappear around the corner of the lane, she understood something with perfect clarity. The Duke had not stumbled into this shop by accident. He had not asked that question out of casual curiosity. He had come looking for confirmation, and she had handed it to him on a pallet. The attic room at the Harley Street townhouse had one window, one chair, and a draught that crept through the floorboards like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Aurelia had lived and worked in this room for 3 years, ever since Lady Ashworth had moved the family from Blackwood Manor's countryside comforts into the London house each season. The countryside attic had been larger, with better light and a view of the valley she had painted so many times she could render it from the colors in her sleep. This London attic offered a narrow rectangle of sky above the rooftops and, on clear nights, a thin slice of moonlight that fell across her easel at just the right angle to make her feel less alone. Tonight, the moon was generous. Aurelia worked by the combined glow of 2 tallow candles and that pale lunar stripe, her brush moving across the first of Lady Ashworth's commissioned canvases, with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a task she could do half awake. The landscape took shape quickly: rolling parkland, a stone bridge over a shallow river, an arrangement of elm trees catching late afternoon sun. It was competent, attractive, and entirely forgettable. The kind of painting that would hang in a drawing room and receive polite compliments from visitors who would never remember it a week later. That was the point. These 2 canvases were for Genevieve, and Aurelia had learned long ago to hold something back when painting for her stepsister. She gave enough skill to impress casual observers, but kept the deeper layers of her ability locked away, saved for work that mattered. It was the only form of rebellion available to her, a secret dilution that Lady Ashworth had never detected because the woman understood ambition far better than she understood art. By 11 o'clock, the first landscape was complete and drying on a makeshift rack Aurelia had built from scrap wood and twine. The second canvas, a portrait of a young woman reading by a window, was sketched in charcoal and would take most of tomorrow to finish in oils. That left tonight for the third painting, the real one. Aurelia pulled the hidden canvas from behind the loose board in the wall where she kept her private supplies. She had stretched and primed it a week ago, using rabbit skin glue she had prepared herself, and the surface was smooth, tight, and ready. It was slightly smaller than the other 2, which meant she could conceal it more easily, but large enough to command attention on an exhibition wall. She set it on her easel and stood back, staring at the blank white ground the way a diver stares at deep water before the leap. What should she paint? The answer had been forming in her mind since the carriage ride that morning, gathering shape and color the way clouds gather before rain. She would paint a self-portrait. Her own face, her own hands, her own eyes looking directly out at the viewer with the kind of steady, unflinching honesty that Genevieve's rehearsed smiles could never imitate. She would paint herself holding a brush, with pigment on her fingers and linseed oil shining on her skin, and anyone who looked at the canvas would know immediately that the woman in the painting and the woman who painted it were one and the same. It was dangerous. It was possibly the most reckless decision she had ever made, and she could not wait to begin. She mixed her ground tones on the battered wooden palette her father had given her, the same one he had used during his own brief years as an amateur painter, before illness had taken his hands, and then the rest of him. The wood was stained with a decade of color, rings of dried pigment, layered like the growth rings of a tree, and every time Aurelia held it, she felt his presence beside her, like warmth from a fire in the next room. The charcoal sketch went down first. Her own face, drawn from the small hand mirror, she kept propped against a stack of books on the windowsill. Then the composition, shoulders turned 3/4, chin lifted slightly, one hand raised with a brush poised above an unseen canvas. The pose suggested a painter caught mid-thought, in the private moment before the first stroke lands, when the entire painting exists as pure possibility inside the artist's mind. She had just begun laying in the first thin wash of raw sienna when she heard a soft knock at the attic door. Aurelia froze. Lady Ashworth never came to the attic. She considered the stairs beneath her dignity and the turpentine fumes offensive to her constitution. Genevieve avoided the room entirely, as though talent were a disease she might catch through proximity. Mrs. Potts sometimes brought up a plate of cold supper, but she always announced herself with a loud, "Food, miss," through the door before entering. This knock was different. Quiet, almost apologetic. "Miss?" a young voice whispered. "It's Edwin, ma'am, from the kitchen." Aurelia opened the door a crack. Edwin was the boot boy, 14 years old, freckled, and perpetually smudged with ash. He stood on the narrow landing, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with common string. "This was left at the servant's door, miss. Man said it was for you particular." "For me? Who left it?" "Didn't give a name, miss. Tall fellow, well-dressed, had a carriage waiting at the end of the lane, said I was to bring it up quiet and tell nobody else in the house." Aurelia took the parcel. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid in her hands. She thanked Edwin, pressed a halfpenny into his palm, and closed the door. The string came away with a single pull. Inside the brown paper sat a ceramic tub, sealed with wax and cloth, roughly the size of a teacup. Aurelia pried the cloth aside and caught her breath. Lapis lazuli. Ground to an impossibly fine powder, the color of a midnight sky over open ocean, so pure and vivid that it seemed to glow against the white ceramic. This was genuine ultramarine, the pigment that cost more per ounce than gold, the color that Renaissance masters had reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary, because no other blue on earth carried such depth and radiance. A small card rested beneath the tub, written in a firm, slanting hand with black ink. "To the true master of the canvas, may the Academy see what I have seen." No signature, no seal, no name. Aurelia sank onto her wooden chair and held the tub of lapis lazuli in both hands, feeling its weight settle against her palms. She thought of the art supply shop, of a duke who asked questions about varnish he already knew the answers to, of dark eyes that studied her the way she studied light, falling across a landscape. He had found her. He had sent her the one pigment she could never afford, the color that would make her self-portrait sing with a brilliance no judge could ignore. She looked at the blank canvas on her easel, then at the midnight blue powder glowing in her hands, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Aurelia allowed herself to believe that the world might contain a door she had not yet tried. She picked up her brush and went to work. Aurelia finished the self-portrait at 4 o'clock in the morning and slept for 3 hours with her head on the work table, her cheek resting against a folded rag that smelled of turpentine and linseed. When she woke, pale daylight was pressing through the attic window, and the painting was watching her from the easel. She sat up and looked at it with the critical distance that a few hours of sleep could provide, searching for flaws the way a jeweler searches for cracks in a cut stone. The portrait was extraordinary. She could admit this to herself here, alone, in the privacy of a room no one else valued. The lapis lazuli had transformed the background into a deep, luminous field of blue that made the figure seem to emerge from the canvas like a woman stepping out of a dream. Her own face stared back at her with calm authority, eyes steady, chin lifted, brush raised in one hand with a thin ribbon of vermilion trailing from its tip. The brushwork in the hands was the finest she had ever achieved, each finger rendered with such precise attention to the way light fell across bone and tendon that they seemed capable of movement. In the bottom right corner, painted in small but clear letters, the color of burnt umber, was her name, Aurelia Ashworth. She covered the canvas with a clean linen cloth and tucked it behind the loose wallboard alongside her private supplies. Then she washed her hands, scrubbing each finger until every trace of pigment was gone, and turned her attention to Genevieve's second commission, the portrait of a young woman reading. By noon, the reading portrait was nearly complete. Aurelia worked steadily through the morning, pausing only to eat the bread and cold ham that Mrs. Potts brought up at 9. The 2 canvases for Genevieve were good, polished, perfectly acceptable work that would draw admiring glances at any exhibition. Lady Ashworth would be satisfied. Genevieve would smile and accept compliments she had not earned. The arrangement would continue as it always had, except that this time there would be a third painting in the hall, one that carried the truth on its surface for anyone with eyes to see. Aurelia was cleaning her brushes at 12:30 when she heard footsteps on the attic stairs. These were different from Edwin's soft shuffle or Mrs. Potts's heavy tread. These steps were quick, purposeful, and accompanied by the rustle of taffeta skirts against the narrow stairwell walls. Genevieve appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from the climb. Her eyes swept the attic with the distaste of someone entering a room she considered beneath her, taking in the paint-stained work table, the drying rack, the jars of pigment lined up along the windowsill, like soldiers in colored uniforms. "Mama wants to see the paintings," Genevieve said. "She is in the drawing room with Mrs. Caldwell from across the square, and she wants to show them off before the exhibition tomorrow. The landscape is dry enough to carry down. The portrait needs another hour." Genevieve nodded absently, but her gaze had already wandered past the 2 visible canvases to the far wall, where the loose board sat slightly askew in its frame. Aurelia's stomach clenched. She had pushed the board back into place that morning, but the linen cloth covering the hidden canvas had shifted, and a thin edge of ultramarine blue was visible through the gap, like a sliver of sky peeking through a crack in a shuttered window. "What is that?" "Old rags," Aurelia said, keeping her voice level. "I store cleaning cloths behind the board to keep them out of the way." Genevieve crossed the room in 4 quick strides. Before Aurelia could move, her stepsister had pulled the board aside and drawn out the covered canvas. The linen cloth fell away, and the self-portrait blazed into the dim attic light like a window flung open onto a summer morning. Genevieve stared at it. Her lips parted and then pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. She looked at the face in the painting, then at Aurelia, then back at the painting. The resemblance was undeniable. The skill was undeniable. The signature in the corner was the final word in a conversation that Genevieve had been pretending was not happening for years. "You painted this," Genevieve said. The words came out flat, stripped of their usual theatrical inflection. "Yes, for the exhibition. Yes. Under your own name." Aurelia said nothing. The answer was written in burnt umber at the bottom of the canvas, and Genevieve could read perfectly well. Something shifted in Genevieve's face. The color rose in her cheeks, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the canvas frame until her knuckles turned white. Aurelia expected shouting. She expected threats, tears, the dramatic outbursts that Genevieve deployed whenever the world failed to arrange itself according to her preferences. Instead, Genevieve set the painting back against the wall with careful, deliberate hands. She straightened up, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked towards the attic door without a word. "Genevieve." The door closed. The iron key turned in the lock from the outside with a sound like a small bone snapping. Then Aurelia heard something she had not anticipated. The soft scrape of the key being withdrawn from the keyhole entirely, followed by Genevieve's footsteps descending the stairs at an unhurried pace. Aurelia reached the door in 3 strides and pressed her palm flat against the wood. She tried the handle. Locked solid. She knelt and looked through the keyhole. Empty. Genevieve had taken the key with her. She stood in the center of the attic and forced herself to breathe. The exhibition judging began tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Submissions had to be delivered to the Royal Academy Hall by 8. If she could not get out of this room with her painting before then, the canvas would remain locked in the attic, unseen and unjudged, and the only work bearing the Ashworth name on the exhibition walls would be Genevieve's borrowed talent. Aurelia tried the window. It opened, but the drop to the alley below was 30 feet onto cobblestones, with no ledge, no drainpipe, and no neighboring roof within reach. She tried the door hinges, pressing and pulling at the iron pins, but they were set deep into the oak frame and would not shift without tools she did not have. She was trapped. The afternoon light crawled across the attic floor, measuring the hours in long golden rectangles that moved from wall to wall like the slow hand of a sundial. Aurelia sat on her wooden chair, her finished masterpiece leaning against the wall beside her, and watched the day drain away through the single window above the rooftops of London. Somewhere in this city, judges were preparing their scorecards. Artists were delivering their finest work to the Academy Hall, and a duke, who had sent her lapis lazuli in the dark, was waiting to see a painting that might never arrive. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and tried to think of a way out. But the locked door held its silence like a promise it intended to keep. The morning arrived gray and damp, the kind of London dawn that pressed against windows like wet wool. Aurelia had not slept. She had spent the night sitting on the floor beside her canvas, her back against the cold plaster wall, listening to the household below her settle into silence, and then, hours later, stir awake again. She heard Mrs. Potts rattling the kitchen grate at 5:30. She heard Edwin hauling coal from the cellar at 6. She heard Lady Ashworth's bedroom door open at 7:15, followed by the measured click of her heels descending the main staircase, and through all of it, Aurelia sat perfectly still, because she had exhausted every possibility the attic room could offer, and found each one closed to her. The door was oak, 2 inches thick, locked from the outside with a mortise bolt she could not reach. The window was 30 feet above hard ground. The floorboards were solid, nailed tight, with no loose sections wide enough to pry open. She had spent 3 hours in the dark testing every surface, every joint, every imperfection in the room's construction, and the attic had defeated her with the indifference of a cage that did not care whether its occupant was desperate or calm. At 8:20, she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of trunks being loaded onto a carriage in the street below. Lady Ashworth and Genevieve were leaving for the exhibition hall. Aurelia pressed her ear against the floorboards and caught fragments of conversation drifting up through the gaps. "Both canvases wrapped and ready, ma'am. Careful with the corners, you clumsy girl. Genevieve, stand straight. The judges will be watching from the moment we arrive." Then carriage wheels on cobblestones, the snap of a whip, and the sound of hooves fading south towards Piccadilly. They were gone. They had taken the 2 paintings Aurelia had made for Genevieve and left the third, the real one, the true one, locked in the attic with its creator. Aurelia closed her eyes and pressed both palms flat against the floor. She had known this was possible. She had known from the moment Genevieve turned that key, and yet some stubborn ember in her chest had kept burning through the night, convinced that a solution would present itself if she only waited long enough. The ember was dying now. At 8:05, the front door knocker sounded. 3 firm strikes, evenly spaced, with the kind of authority that made the entire house pause and listen. Aurelia heard Mrs. Potts cross the entrance hall, heard the front door open, and then heard a voice that sent a jolt through her tired body, like cold water on bare skin. "Good morning. I am Duke Julian Ashford. I carry an official invitation from the Royal Academy judging panel for the Ashworth household. I should like to deliver it personally." Mrs. Potts' flustered response was too muffled to make out through the floor, but the front door opened wider, and Aurelia heard Julian's boots cross the threshold and enter the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and pressed her mouth against the crack beneath the attic door. "I am here," she called, pitching her voice just loud enough to carry down the narrow stairwell. "I am locked in the attic." Silence from below. Then the low murmur of Julian's voice speaking to someone, Mrs. Potts or perhaps the butler, Mr. Harding, in tones too quiet for Aurelia to decipher. Footsteps moved through the ground floor, paused, and then began climbing. One set was heavy and reluctant. The other was steady and sure. "Miss Ashworth?" Julian's voice came from the other side of the attic door, close enough that Aurelia could hear him clearly. "Are you well?" "I am well, Your Grace. The door is locked and the key has been removed." A pause. Then Julian spoke again, this time directed away from the door. "Mr. Harding, I believe this door requires opening. Your Grace, I am not certain that Lady Ashworth would." "Mr. Harding." Julian's tone did not rise. It did not sharpen. It simply became the kind of voice that reminded everyone within earshot that the man speaking held a title older than the house they were standing in. "There is a young woman locked in a room without food or water on a morning when she is expected at a public exhibition. I am confident that Lady Ashworth would want this matter corrected immediately. The key, if you please." Another pause, shorter this time. Then the sound of Mr. Harding's footsteps retreating down the stairs, a drawer opening and closing somewhere on the first floor, and the footsteps returning. Aurelia heard metal slide into the lock, felt the mechanism turn through the wood beneath her fingertips, and the door swung open. Julian stood on the narrow landing in a dark blue coat, his hat in one hand. Behind him, Mr. Harding held the spare key, with the expression of a man who suspected he would be answering uncomfortable questions about this later. Julian looked at Aurelia, at her creased dress, her unwashed face, the shadows beneath her eyes, and something passed across his features that was too controlled to be called anger, but too sharp to be called concern. It lived somewhere between the two, in a territory that suggested he understood exactly what had happened and was choosing, with considerable discipline, to address the practical matter first and the moral one later. "The exhibition submissions close in less than 2 hours," he said. "Do you have a painting to deliver?" Aurelia stepped aside and gestured towards the canvas, leaning against the wall. Julian entered the attic, and when his gaze fell on the self-portrait, he went still. He stood before it for a long moment, studying the luminous blue background, the steady eyes, the hands holding the brush with such assured grace. The lapis lazuli he had sent glowed from the canvas like trapped starlight. "Extraordinary," he said softly. Then he turned to Aurelia with an expression that held something warmer than admiration. "Shall we?" Aurelia wrapped the canvas in the linen cloth, tucked it under her arm, and followed the Duke down the stairs and out through the front door into the grey London morning. His private carriage waited at the curb, black lacquered wood with brass fittings, and a matched pair of bay horses stamping restlessly against the damp cobblestones. Julian handed her up into the carriage, then passed the wrapped painting in after her with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable. He climbed in opposite her and rapped twice on the roof. "The Royal Academy," he told the driver. "Quickly." The carriage lurched forward into the morning traffic, weaving between carts and sedan chairs and pedestrians carrying umbrellas against the misting rain. Aurelia sat with the canvas across her knees, her heart beating against her ribs like a drum keeping time with the rattling wheels beneath her. "Thank you," she said. Julian looked at her across the narrow carriage. "You can thank me by showing them who you are." Aurelia tightened her grip on the painting and watched London rush past the window, every street carrying her closer to the moment she had spent her entire life preparing for, without ever believing it would come. The Royal Academy occupied a grand stone building on the north side of Pall Mall, its facade lined with tall columns that made every person who passed through its entrance feel slightly smaller than they had felt on the street outside. Aurelia had walked past this building a dozen times during her years in London, always on the opposite pavement, always carrying parcels or running errands, always looking up at those columns, with the quiet hunger of someone standing outside a feast they had not been invited to attend. Today, she walked through the front door. The main exhibition hall was a vast rectangular room with a vaulted ceiling painted in soft cream and gold. Paintings already hung on every available inch of wall space, arranged in the traditional manner, the finest works placed at eye level along a central band called the line. while lesser pieces were stacked above and below in crowded rows that climbed towards the ceiling moldings. Gas lamps in brass brackets cast a steady, warm light across the canvases, and the smell of fresh varnish and turpentine hung in the air like perfume at a dance. The room was already half full when Aurelia and Julian arrived. Gentlemen in dark coats and high collars moved between the paintings, with catalogues in hand. Ladies in mourning dresses whispered behind gloved fingers. A long table near the eastern wall held ledgers where artists registered their submissions, and behind the table sat 3 men in powdered wigs who looked as though they had been judging paintings since before Aurelia was born. Julian guided her through the crowd with a light hand near her elbow, steering her past clusters of patrons and critics, who parted instinctively when they recognized the Duke's face. Aurelia clutched her wrapped canvas against her chest and tried to ignore the stares. A young woman in a creased dress with shadows under her eyes, walking beside one of the most prominent men in English society, carrying a painting that smelled faintly of attic dust and linseed oil. They reached the registration table at 12 minutes past 9. The eldest judge, a man with heavy spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger. "Submissions close at 10 o'clock, he said. "Name and title of the work?" "Aurelia Ashworth," she said. "The painting is titled Self-Portrait with Brush." The judge recorded the entry, assigned her a number, and directed her towards an empty section of wall near the southern windows where late submissions were being hung. Julian helped her unwrap the canvas and position it on the hanging rail, and when the linen cloth fell away, a woman standing nearby drew a sharp breath. The self-portrait caught the morning light from the tall windows and held it. The lapis lazuli background glowed with an almost supernatural depth, pulling the viewer's eye inward, while the figure, Aurelia's own face and hands, pushed outward with a presence that demanded attention. It was the kind of painting that rearranged the space around it, making the neighboring canvases seem flatter and quieter by comparison. Aurelia stepped back and let the painting speak for itself. She had done everything she could. The rest belonged to the judges. She found a seat on a wooden bench near the far wall and watched the hall fill over the next hour. More paintings arrived. More artists clustered near their work, adjusting frames and straightening hanging cords with nervous fingers. The 3 judges moved slowly along the walls, making notes in their ledgers, pausing longest before the works that interested them and passing quickly over those that did not. At 10:30, Lady Ashworth and Genevieve arrived. Aurelia saw them before they saw her. Lady Ashworth swept into the hall in a dress of deep plum silk, her expression set in the particular arrangement of confidence and authority that she wore to public events like armor. Genevieve walked a half-step behind, in pale green muslin, her face freshly powdered, and her hair arranged in careful ringlets that must have taken a maid an hour to pin. 2 servants followed, carrying the landscape and portrait canvases that Aurelia had painted for Genevieve. They were hung on the opposite wall from Aurelia's self-portrait, and Lady Ashworth positioned Genevieve beside them, with the practiced staging of a theater director, arranging actors before the curtain rises. It took Lady Ashworth precisely 4 minutes to spot the self-portrait across the hall. Aurelia watched the recognition travel through her stepmother's body. First, the slight turn of the head, then the narrowing of the eyes, then the slow stiffening of the spine, as the implications settled into place. Lady Ashworth's gaze swept the room and found Aurelia on the bench, and for a single moment, something close to genuine alarm crossed her carefully composed face. Then it vanished, replaced by the cold calculation that Aurelia knew far better. Lady Ashworth whispered something to Genevieve, and both of them turned towards the judge's table with renewed purpose. Aurelia could not hear what was said, but she could read the performance, Genevieve gesturing towards her 2 canvases, describing her artistic process with the same rehearsed fluency she had attempted at the ball, while Lady Ashworth stood beside her, nodding and smiling at each judge who passed. At 11 o'clock, the head judge called for the formal evaluation to begin. Each artist with a submitted entry was invited to stand beside their work and answer questions from the panel. This was the moment Lady Ashworth had prepared Genevieve for. The moment when charm and confidence were supposed to carry the performance across the finish line. Julian stepped forward from the crowd and addressed the head judge in a clear, carrying voice. Before the formal evaluation begins, I should like to propose a brief practical demonstration. The Academy has always valued technical mastery alongside artistic vision. I suggest that each artist who has submitted work today be invited to perform a short live demonstration of their skill. A simple color blend on a prepared board. Nothing elaborate, merely proof that the hand which claims the painting is the hand that made it. The hall went quiet. The head judge looked at his two colleagues. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd like wind passing through a wheat field. An unusual request, Your Grace, the head judge said. Though not without precedent, the Academy did require live demonstrations in its early years. He turned to address the room. Would the submitting artists consent to such a test? Several painters near the front nodded immediately, some with enthusiasm, others with the quiet confidence of professionals who had nothing to fear from a public display of their craft. Genevieve's face drained of every shade of color Aurelia had ever mixed on a palette. Lady Ashworth placed a firm hand on her daughter's arm, leaned close, and whispered urgently into her ear. Genevieve shook her head once, twice, and then a third time, each shake smaller and more desperate than the last. Miss Genevieve Ashworth, the head judge called, consulting his ledger. You have submitted 2 works this morning. Would you care to demonstrate? The hall turned its collective attention towards Genevieve, like a spotlight finding its mark. She stood beside her borrowed paintings, her gloved hands clasped so tightly together that Aurelia could see the tremor in her fingers from 30 feet away. I am feeling unwell, Genevieve said, her voice barely reaching the middle of the room. I am afraid I must decline. The murmur returned, louder this time, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of doubt. The murmur in the hall did not fade. It grew, spreading from one cluster of spectators to the next, like ripples crossing a pond after a stone has been dropped into still water. Genevieve stood frozen beside her 2 canvases, her face the color of fresh plaster, while Lady Ashworth gripped her arm with fingers that had turned white at the knuckles. The head judge adjusted his spectacles and made a note in his ledger. The scratch of his quill against the paper was audible in the uneasy silence that had settled over the front of the room. Very well, he said, his tone measured and careful. Miss Genevieve Ashworth declines the demonstration. The panel will take this under consideration during its final assessment. He consulted his list again. Miss Aurelia Ashworth, you have submitted 1 work, Self-Portrait with Brush. Will you demonstrate? Aurelia rose from the bench. Her legs felt strange beneath her, hollow and light, as though the floor might give way with each step. She had not eaten since yesterday's bread and ham. She had not slept more than a handful of broken minutes on the attic floor. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair was pinned haphazardly with the same 2 pins she had found in her pocket that morning, and she was fairly certain there was a faint smudge of raw umber along the edge of her left ear that she had missed while washing. She walked to the front of the hall and stood beside her self-portrait. I will demonstrate, she said. A wooden easel had been set up near the judge's table, holding a small prepared board of stretched linen, primed with a thin layer of lead white. Beside it, a table held an assortment of pigments in ceramic dishes, 3 brushes of varying sizes, a palette knife, and a small cup of linseed oil. Standard materials, nothing exotic, the kind of supplies any competent painter could work with blindfolded. Aurelia picked up the palette knife and began mixing colors on the wooden palette, with a fluidity that came from years of repetition. She did not think about the crowd watching her. She did not think about Lady Ashworth's rigid fury or Genevieve's crumbling composure. She thought about paint. She chose to demonstrate an oil glazing technique, one of the most demanding skills in a painter's vocabulary, requiring absolute control of pigment density, brush pressure, and drying time. The method involved laying thin, translucent layers of color over a dry base, allowing each layer to modify the one beneath it, the way colored glass, placed over a candle, changes the quality of the light that passes through. She started with a base tone of yellow ochre, spreading it smoothly across the board, in even strokes. Then, while the audience watched, she mixed a thin glaze of alizarin crimson with linseed oil until the pigment was barely more than a whisper of color suspended in liquid. She loaded a soft, flat brush and drew it across the ochre ground in a single, unhesitating pass. The effect was immediate. Where the crimson glaze met the yellow base, a warm, living tone emerged, the exact shade of light falling across human skin at golden hour, the color that portrait painters spent years learning to achieve and that most never truly mastered. Aurelia laid a second glaze of raw umber along the lower edge, creating a shadow that receded naturally into depth, then touched a tiny highlight of pure lead white, mixed with Naples yellow, at the crest of the form. In less than 5 minutes, she had produced a small study of light on skin that looked as though it could breathe. The hall was silent. The particular kind of silence that falls when a room full of people collectively recognizes that they are witnessing something they will remember for a long time. The head judge leaned forward in his chair and examined the glazing study through his spectacles. He looked at the study, then at the self-portrait hanging on the wall, then back at the study. The connection between the two was unmistakable. The same hand, the same eye, the same deep understanding of how light and pigment conspired together to create the illusion of life on a flat surface. The brushwork is identical, the second judge said quietly to his colleague, though his voice carried further than he intended. Look at the highlight placement, the same instinct in both pieces. The head judge removed his spectacles, polished them on his sleeve, and replaced them before speaking. Miss Aurelia Ashworth, the panel would like to examine your submitted work in greater detail. Would you be so kind as to walk us through your process? Aurelia set down the brush and moved to stand beside her self-portrait. She spoke clearly, without rehearsal, describing the rabbit skin glue ground she had prepared, the charcoal underdrawing, the sequence of oil layers she had built up over 12 hours of continuous work. She explained her choice of lapis lazuli for the background, how the mineral pigment carried a depth of blue that no synthetic color could replicate, and how she had ground it herself and mixed it with walnut oil rather than linseed to preserve its clarity. She described the specific challenges of painting hands, the way each finger required individual attention to the fall of light across its particular curve of bone and muscle. She spoke the way her father had taught her to speak about painting, with precision, with warmth, and with the absolute authority of someone who had earned her knowledge through 10,000 hours of solitary practice in cold attic rooms. When she finished, the head judge turned to the 2 canvases hanging on the opposite wall, the landscape and portrait submitted under Genevieve's name. Miss Genevieve, he said, the panel observes a notable similarity in technique between your submitted works and those demonstrated by Miss Aurelia Ashworth. Would you care to comment? Genevieve opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Lady Ashworth stepped forward, her chin raised, ready to deliver whatever explanation she had been constructing for the past 20 minutes. But the head judge raised one hand, palm outward, and the gesture carried the full weight of an institution that had been guarding the integrity of English art for decades. I addressed the question to the submitting artist. Madam, Lady Ashworth's mouth closed. Genevieve looked at her mother, then at Aurelia, then at the floor. The silence stretched like canvas pulled tight across a frame. I did not paint them, Genevieve said. Her voice was small and flat, and carried the particular exhaustion of someone setting down a weight they had been carrying far longer than their strength allowed. Aurelia painted them. She painted all of them, every canvas, every portrait, every landscape, all of it was hers. The hall erupted. Voices rose from every corner, shocked whispers, indignant murmurs, a few sharp exclamations from artists who understood immediately what the confession meant. Lady Ashworth seized Genevieve's elbow and pulled her towards the door, her face a mask of contained fury that promised consequences Aurelia would never have to witness, because for the first time in her life, the distance between herself and that woman was growing wider with every passing second. The head judge called for order. The room settled. He turned to Aurelia, who stood beside her self-portrait with paint still drying on her fingers and exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. "Miss Aurelia Ashworth," he said, "on behalf of the Royal Academy judging panel, I am pleased to inform you that your work has been selected for the line. Furthermore, the panel recommends you for the Academy's annual Royal Commission, pending formal approval by the Board of Governors." The applause began somewhere near the back of the hall and moved forward like a wave-gathering force as it approaches the shore. Aurelia stood in the middle of it, paint on her hands, turpentine in her hair, wearing a dress that cost less than the frames on half the paintings in the room, and felt the sound wash over her like warm rain after a drought that had lasted her entire life. Julian appeared beside her. He did not applaud. He simply stood at her shoulder, close enough that she could hear him speak beneath the noise of the crowd. "I told you," he said. "Show them who you are." Aurelia looked at her self-portrait, her own steady eyes gazing back at her from a field of lapis blue, and for the first time, the woman in the painting and the woman standing before it occupied the same space in the world, equal in skill, equal in name, and finally, irreversibly, seen.